November 20th, 1944, Hürtgen Forest, Germany. Snow had not yet fallen, but the sky threatened it. A low gray ceiling hung over the ruined forest, blotting out the sun, casting everything in a dull, bruised light. The trees, what was left of them, jutted like broken spears from the damp soil, and every inch of earth was soaked in blood and fog. Oberleutnant Karl Reiter adjusted his field glasses and scanned the tree line ahead. Somewhere out there, hidden in the splinters of pine and collapsed trenches, was the enemy. He could hear them, faint boots on mud-clipped American orders, the occasional clatter of gear. They were close. But Reiter wasn't worried. He stood next to a monster, a Panzerkampfwagen VA Panther, 45 tons of sloped steel, armed with a 75 mkWk 42 L70 cannon that could punch through any Sherman at 1,000 meters. The Americans could bring 10 tanks if they wanted. The Panther didn't care. Behind him, 3 more Panthers moved in formation, their diesel engines growling low like hunting wolves. "Amerikaner," muttered his driver, peering through the slit. "They send children with toys." Reiter smirked. He had heard about the American bazooka, a crude tube that fired a shaped charge no faster than a thrown grenade. Nothing to worry about. Nothing that could touch the armor of a Panther. Then the forest twitched. A rustle too regular to be wind. A shape motionless until it was. And then a sound. Not the crack of a rifle, not the mechanical bark of a machine gun. It was a whoosh, like a gas main opening under pressure. Then the side of the lead Panther disappeared in fire. Reiter ducked, instinct overriding pride. The tank beside him rocked on its treads as if something had punched it from the inside. Flames burst from the side hatch. A second later, the turret blew off like a toy cap. "Was Wardes?" a gunner screamed. But Reiter already knew. It was the sound of something small, something American, punching through his invincible war machine. And the Americans weren't done. Another whoosh. Another blast. The second Panther buckled as a rocket slammed into its engine deck from behind. It hadn't even turned its turret. Smoke belched upward, black and thick and final. The forest was alive now, not with infantry but with shadows carrying tubes. Tubes that should have been useless, but they were. The bazooka was back. And it had evolved. Not the clumsy, short-range weapon Reiter had laughed at in Sicily. Not the hopeless tool that bounced off panzers in Normandy. This was the M1A1. And in the hands of American infantry, it was rewriting the rules of engagement. Reiter shouted into his radio, "Reverse, reverse," but it was too late. A third whoosh, this one fired from a trench barely 10 meters away. The last Panther in the column erupted into fire, its commander climbing out screaming, jacket aflame. Reiter was alone. And the forest had gone silent again, except for the hiss of melting snow on steel. He turned, rifle raised, and glimpsed the enemy. A U.S. soldier no more than 20, face smeared in dirt, a bazooka hoisted on his shoulder like a club. Not running, not hiding, just standing. The boy smiled, then vanished into the smoke. The next Panther column wouldn't roll for another 2 days. They would find nothing but husks. And spent tubes. And American boot prints. What the Germans had once mocked as useless had become something else. It wasn't a tank killer by design. It had become one by doctrine. And doctrine was about to shatter steel. 2 days later, frost blanketed the wrecks. The twisted hulls of the Panthers still smoldered in the fog, their blackened turrets tilted toward the sky like broken monuments. Nearby, shattered pine trees leaned over the scorched forest floor, their branches shredded by shrapnel. Steam rose from ruptured radiators and the half-frozen blood of burned crewmen. Major Klaus Eberhardt stared at the wrecks in silence, lips tight. He had commanded Panthers on the Eastern Front through Kursk and Kharkov, and had never seen three knocked out so cleanly, so methodically by infantry. Not tanks, not air strikes, not artillery, just men with tubes. The engineers poked through the charred remains. One of them lifted the jagged steel cone from the Panther's side hull. Shaped charge, high penetration, this wasn't lucky. This was deliberate. Eberhard didn't respond. He was staring at the dirt near one of the knocked-out Panthers. He saw boot prints, American, no more than a few hours old when the attack had occurred. And next to them, the bent remnants of a launch tube discarded like a cigarette butt. The blast pattern confirmed it. The Americans had gotten within 30 meters from a Panther tank, and lived to walk away. That was not bravery, that was doctrine. And it meant everything the Wehrmacht thought it understood about infantry versus armor had just changed. 10 miles south, Private Frank Dempsey knelt in a snowbank behind a thick beech tree, gripping a bazooka like it was part of his spine. His partner, Corporal Jimmy Slater, lay prone in the brush, feeding the second rocket into the tube with practiced silence. They didn't talk anymore before a shot, not like back in Normandy, where every bazooka team was two kids learning how not to die. Now they moved like ghosts, spoke with hand signals, fired and vanished before the blast had finished echoing. Ahead of them, they heard the familiar groan of a Panther engine cresting the ridge. "Left track," Slater mouthed, pointing. Dempsey nodded. The two had taken down 3 tanks in 4 days. They had started with the old M1 model back in Italy, a finicky, underpowered tube that felt like a toy. But now they carried the M1A1, stronger propellant, better penetration, and more faith. The kind of faith that came from watching a rocket melt through 3 inches of Panther side armor like butter. And they had learned, painfully, bloodily, how to use it. You don't face a Panther head-on. You don't shoot from open ground. You don't wait until the tank is looking at you. You wait until it's blind. You use the trees, the shell holes, the fog. You let it think it's hunting. Then you hit it from the side. Then you disappear. Reinforced steel, sloped hull, 80mm glacis plate, 75mm high-velocity gun. The Panther was supposed to be indestructible, and it had been once. In the open, against other tanks, it was death. But in the forest, in the churned ruins of Belgium and the shattered bones of France, armor wasn't everything. A rifle couldn't stop it, but a man could. One man, one rocket. If he was close enough, if he was patient enough. If he didn't miss. German tank crews started to get superstitious. Some refused to ride without infantry screens ahead of them. Others demanded flares to flush out ambushes. One Panther crew, according to a field report from the 116th Panzer Division, refused to move forward unless someone had walked the road first. One commander barked at his men, "What's next? You afraid of squirrels with tubes?" But they were afraid, not of the bazooka itself, but of what it represented. That nowhere was safe. That being inside a Panther no longer made you invincible. Back near Schmidt, in the dark trench lines overlooking the next wooded trail, Dempsey and Slater waited again. Snowflakes drifted over their shoulders as they loaded the next rocket. This one was their last. Logistics had been a nightmare since the push into Germany began, and bazooka rockets were gold. 2 pounds of copper and explosives that could decide whether a squad lived or died. They heard the treads before they saw the tank. Panthers were quiet, deceptively so, their engines muffled by snow and air. But the metallic grind was unmistakable, the hungry, bored growl of steel rolling forward. Slater whispered, "It's gonna pass us." Dempsey leaned forward, breath low. They let it roll 10 meters past their hide, waited for the infantry screen to walk past, and then rose like shadows. Slater steadied the tube. Dempsey sighted in on the exhaust vent, always the weak spot. One squeeze, the trigger snapped. Whoosh! The rocket streaked out in a blur of smoke. The explosion tore into the back of the Panther, with a sound like God slamming a door. Instantly, the turret clanged sideways, the entire machine lurching like a hit animal. The rear panel burst open in flame. One of the crew flung himself out, screaming, his legs on fire. The others didn't follow. The infantry up ahead froze, just long enough. Dempsey dropped the tube, yanked his Thompson up, and the ambush finished the rest. They vanished before the next Panther even crested the ridge. Field reports across November and December told the same story. Dozens of Panther tanks knocked out by infantry with rocket launchers, not just from the front lines, from tree lines, from cellar windows, from roadside ditches, from the shadows between ruined barns. The Wehrmacht command dismissed the early reports. Poorly trained crews, they said, close-range lucky shots. But the data piled up, and the fear followed. It wasn't the weapon itself that changed the war. It was what the weapon had enabled. An ordinary man could kill a giant. In Aachen, a Panther crew turned into a side alley and never came out. In the Ardennes, 2 bazooka teams knocked out an entire armored spearhead before being overrun, and still managed to crawl away in the snow, bleeding but alive. The Germans began arming their own troops with Panzerfausts, but they were heavy, short-range, mostly single-use. The bazooka could reload, move, fire again. For every Panther in the field, there were now 10 American squads trained to kill it. Not just with brute strength. With speed, with silence, with steel nerves and a 10-second window to breathe, aim, fire, and vanish. And yet not every ambush was clean. Dempsey's third kill came with a price. He'd stepped 1 foot too far into view. The Panther spotted him just after the rocket left the tube. The round slammed home, but the turret had already rotated. The coaxial MG-34 cut a line across his hip. Slater dragged him back through the snow by the straps of his webbing. The last thing Dempsey saw before blacking out was the Panther's turret still spinning, even as fire licked up through the driver's hatch. He woke up 3 days later in a field hospital outside Monschau. They told him the tank had burned for 8 hours. He just whispered, "Hope someone got my tube." They had. Slater had taken it. And used it. Twice. Across the Siegfried line, Panther commanders changed how they moved. They no longer advanced alone. They no longer entered towns without scouting. Because everywhere they rolled now. Every alley, every hedge, every culvert. They feared what might be waiting. Not a tank. Not a mine. Not a plane. Just a man. A man with a tube. The ice came in early that winter. Hard, bitter frost that turned roads to glass and leaves to razors. Panther tanks idled behind the lines, exhaust pluming like dragon breath in the frozen air. Major Klaus Eberhardt lit a cigarette with trembling fingers. It wasn't the cold. He hadn't been warm in weeks. It was something else, something deeper. The problem wasn't the Americans, not exactly. It was that the Americans had changed. They didn't just hold ground anymore. They waited for tanks. They laid traps like wolves, and the weapon wasn't artillery or armor or even aircraft. It was the bazooka, the rower mit Ziel, the tube with a soul, as his men were beginning to call it. They spoke about it in whispers now, about squads disappearing into ruins and never returning, about how every ruined village, every cratered road bend might hold a farmer's son from Kentucky or Kansas with a steel pipe and one chance. It had become a hunter's war. And the Panthers were no longer the hunters. At the edge of a ruined farmhouse outside Rocherath, Belgium, Corporal Jimmy Slater held his breath as a Panther rolled through the rubble. It was close enough to feel the vibration through the soles of his boots. The windows of the farmhouse had long since been blown out by artillery, but the outer walls held just enough shadow for concealment. Inside the collapsed barn, 3 other Americans crouched, all watching the tank's movement through narrow slits in the wooden planks. One held a Thompson, one had a Springfield. Slater carried the bazooka. They weren't even supposed to be there. The rest of the platoon had pulled back 6 hours earlier after a recon report said armor was massing nearby. But Slater had stayed, not out of disobedience, but because he wanted the shot. Because by now, the squads had become believers. Not in the Army, not in Patton, not even in victory. They believed in the bazooka. The Panther turned its turret, scanning the street with eerie patience. Its commander poked out of the hatch, goggles gleaming in the moonlight, scanning with binoculars. Slater exhaled through his nose and slowly, carefully, raised the launcher. His loader whispered, "Too close." Slater whispered back, "Perfect." He took aim at the lower rear hull, the one place where Panther armor was practically paper-thin. The rocket would melt through like a hot nail through butter. He pressed the trigger. The scream of the rocket was deafening in the confined space. The backblast shattered the remaining barn window. Outside, the rocket struck true. The back of the Panther erupted in a column of flame. The engine block split in 2, the turret jumped like it had been slapped by a god, and black smoke billowed across the sky. The German infantry escort panicked. Gunfire raked the village, random, wild, searching for enemies they couldn't see. But Slater's team was already gone, slipping out the back of the house, darting into the forest beyond. 10 minutes later, the Panther still burned, casting orange shadows on the snow. The after-action report from the U.S. 2nd Infantry Division didn't even mention Slater by name. Just one line: enemy armor eliminated by forward bazooka team during holding action. But within the Wehrmacht's panzer units, stories spread like plague. Bazookas in cellars, bazookas in haystacks, bazookas rigged to timers, bazookas used by men who fired once, then sprinted into the woods and vanished. The Panther, once a symbol of invincibility, had become a target. Not a tank, a tomb. In December, as the Germans began final preparations for what they called Unternehmen Wacht am Rhein, the Ardennes offensive, field commanders issued new instructions: avoid narrow terrain, avoid blind corners, use infantry scouts ahead of armored columns. It was doctrine born from fear. They weren't afraid of American tanks. Not really. The Sherman couldn't touch a Panther from the front. They weren't even afraid of mines. But the bazooka, that was personal, that was unpredictable. That was a private first class who hadn't eaten hot food in 2 weeks, who'd lost 3 friends in Normandy, and who had learned how to wait. On December 16th, when the Germans launched their last great gamble in the Ardennes, Panthers led the charge. And they began to die. Not all at once, not in great numbers. But just enough, one at a time. A rocket through the side hull near Monschau, another into the turret seam near Boulingen, a third from an attic window near St. Vith. Every day, the count ticked upward. Not from airstrikes, not from artillery, but from infantry. From bazooka teams who had made a science of patience. By the second week of the offensive, Panther crews were refusing to drive through towns without foot patrols. Some units even started retrofitting tanks with improvised side skirts, salvaged from wreckage, trying to shield the vulnerable side armor. It didn't help. The Americans had learned where to hit, when to hit, and how to vanish. They weren't brave. They were methodical. Like snipers with rockets. Slater and Dempsey were back together again by Christmas. Dempsey limped now. The wound from Hurtgen hadn't healed clean, but he could still aim, still load, still fire. They'd taken down 7 Panthers between them. and the last two had been on the same day. They didn't talk about it, just shared a cigarette, cleaned the tube, waited for the next silhouette to move across the tree line. At some point, it had stopped being terrifying. It had just become routine. Major Eberhardt read the reports with grim silence. Panthers knocked out in ambushes, crew survivability dropping, tank companies reduced to half strength in 3 days. He circled a number on the page. 11. 11 Panther tanks destroyed by bazookas in one sector in less than a week. It wasn't the number that disturbed him. It was the way they were destroyed, not by frontal assault, not in fair fights, but from behind, from the sides, from places tanks should have been safe. His tanks weren't dying in battle. They were being hunted. By the 3rd week of the Ardennes campaign, the word had spread. Not through official dispatches or radio briefings. It moved faster than that, in whispers over engine blocks, in nervous glances during tank briefings, in the way drivers paused before every corner. It was Bazooka. That was the American name. The Germans had a different term now. Geisterrohr. The ghost tube. It wasn't just a weapon. It was a presence, an omen. It meant you were being watched even if you didn't see it, even if your armor was thick, even if you were in a Panther. Especially then. Major Eberhardt walked the perimeter of the 4th Panzer Regiment staging area outside Malmedy, taking stock of his crews. What he saw disturbed him more than the losses. The Panther gunners smoked with shaking hands. Some refused to sleep inside the tanks now. Others demanded infantry guards while refueling. A few had scratched crude charms into their steel, iron crosses, family initials, prayers. "Sir, we need to speak," one commander muttered, barely above a whisper. "We can't keep pushing into towns like this. The streets, the alleys, they're waiting for us." Eberhardt didn't ask who they were. He already knew. In a collapsed farmhouse near Trois Ponts, Private Dempsey steadied his breathing and aimed his bazooka through a jagged window. He didn't smile anymore. He didn't speak much at all. He had gotten good at this, too good. They'd taken down 11 tanks now. His hit ratio was over 70%. He didn't miss. He didn't flinch. His loader, a 19-year-old from Ohio named Keenan, handed him a rocket. "Third one today," Keenan whispered. Dempsey didn't nod. He just waited. The Panther turned the corner slowly, cautiously, like it already knew. But it didn't know enough. The rocket hit just under the turret ring, a perfect shot. The commander tried to bail out. Dempsey fired again, point blank. No hesitation. The second shot finished it. The hatch blew open like a popped can. Smoke coiled upward. The sound echoed down the empty street. The silence after was louder than the shot. Keenan muttered, "God, I hate this war." Dempsey just loaded another round. That night they sat in a cellar beneath the town church. The walls shook from distant artillery, but the air was quiet between them. "What if we're no better than they are?" Keenan asked. Dempsey didn't answer at first, then finally. "We don't start the fire. We just make sure it doesn't reach home." 2 villages away, German engineers pulled another scorched Panther out of a ditch. The treads were melted. The crew had been incinerated in their seats. Nothing left but bones fused to metal. One officer stared at the entry wound. Side hull, angle of 28 degrees, penetration clean, exit blue through the turret battery compartment. Rocket. Of course, American, probably from 25 meters. He looked up at the ridgeline. How do they get that close? The answer came from a private in the corner, barely 19. They're always already there. In the high command bunker near Bonn, field intelligence reports flooded in. Panther unit ambushed south of Elsenborn. No survivors. Tank column lost 3 hulls in Neff, all to infantry. Captured American soldiers report coordinated bazooka teams, operating in pairs or trios, using radio scouts and pre-sighted kill zones. For a while, the command believed it was exaggeration. Then photos arrived, video reels, audio recordings from burned-out command vehicles. It was real, and it was spreading. In Metz, a Panther platoon refused to enter the town without support. Their commander, a veteran of Normandy, radioed in. "We don't have armor, we're riding coffins." Back at the front, Slater and Dempsey moved as one. They had started marking their own map, not towns, not villages. Paths, vantage points, kill zones. They called it the Arc, a stretch of German territory where every hedgerow, every wall, every culvert had been claimed by rocket fire. They didn't have orders to hold it. They didn't even care who did. They just made sure no Panther crossed it. One day they ambushed a column of 3. The first went down in second, side shot, engine block. The second tried to reverse. Slater fired into the turret ring. The third turned to flee and drove directly over a team hiding in the trench. One soldier was crushed instantly. The other, a sergeant named Farley, crawled out, broken-legged, lifted his bazooka from the mud, and fired from the ground. The third tank exploded 20 feet ahead. Dempsey dragged Farley back under fire, one arm hooked around his chest. Farley laughed the whole time. "They're starting to run now," he wheezed. "They don't even shoot first, they run." At night you could hear it, not shelling, not distant engines. Just silence, a tension in the woods, and the slow grinding fear of the men inside every Panther. Major Eberhardt's last report before the end of the campaign said it plainly. "It is no longer a matter of armor. Our crews are hunted. The enemy holds the ground without tanks, without artillery, with only men and their tubes. We must assume any terrain not bombarded is occupied by a team capable of tank kills. Our armor advantage has become a liability in confined terrain." The Panther has no answer to silence. By February, the Panther was still feared, but only at distance. Up close, it was a steel coffin. And everyone knew it, especially the ones who rode inside. Snow fell on the ruins of Prüm in early March. Fine and quiet, like dust settling after something sacred had been broken. Panther tanks lay rusting in the streets. Some were burned out, their turrets blown clean off, the shells of once mighty machines gaping at the sky. Others remained intact but abandoned, their crews long gone, killed, captured, or disappeared into the forest, never to be seen again. The American columns didn't even bother to slow as they passed the wrecks. They had seen too many. Private First Class Dempsey sat in the back of a deuce-and-a-half truck, legs dangling, his bazooka resting across his lap like a forgotten tool. The truck bounced through a cratered road, and he barely noticed. He had stopped counting kills weeks ago. His loader, the third one now, a kid from Minnesota who hadn't even been born when Hitler took power, sat beside him, saying nothing. They didn't need words anymore. The war was ending. You could feel it in the silence of the towns, the way the German artillery had stopped firing at night. Even the tank tracks had begun to vanish from the snow, as if the Panthers themselves were dissolving into history. And yet they still carried the tube. Because it wasn't over, not yet. In the ruins of Köln, Sergeant Ulrich Dietrich sat with a cigarette between his fingers, his Panzer uniform torn and stained. The 9th Panzer Division had lost 14 tanks in 2 weeks, not to air raids, not to Shermans, but to infantry, to small, faceless teams that had learned how to move like smoke and kill like snipers. He hadn't slept in 2 nights. His crew had abandoned the last Panther before it even made it to the intersection. They'd seen the collapsed storefront, the glint of steel in a second-story window, and bailaid out before the rocket hit. It was a direct shot, precise, no hesitation. They never saw the gunner's face, only the whoosh and the fire that came after. Ulrich had trained for years to fight tanks, to duel with other armor, to outmaneuver, outflank, outshoot. But he'd spent the last month terrified of doorways, of cellar grates, of shadows in the snow. And he wasn't alone. Across the Rhine, in the shadow of the Siegfried Line, German officers filed their final armored combat assessments. They were blunt. Panther performance compromised in all terrain featuring urban density or forested concealment. Enemy infantry, now trained to act as dedicated tank hunters. Losses sustained in high-confined terrain do not justify armored deployment without overwhelming support. Psychological impact of bazooka ambushes is now greater than mechanical loss. The document didn't say it plainly, but it was there between the lines. The tank was no longer king. And the Americans had written that truth with nothing more than steel tubes and stubborn infantry. Dempsey fired his last bazooka round outside a village north of Remagen. A Panther had broken from the tree line, too fast, too reckless, probably a desperate push from an overconfident commander. Dempsey hit it from 30 meters, aiming low, letting the rocket arc into the tracks. It caught just behind the drive sprocket and snapped the steel like twine. The tank spun once, then stalled. The crew tried to escape, but American machine guns cut them down before they made it 10 steps. Dempsey didn't move, didn't blink. His new loader exhaled slowly. You ever think about what happens when it's over? Dempsey shrugged. You go home, he said, and the sound stays with you. Berlin fell weeks later. Not to bazookas, but to Red Army tanks, to house-to-house combat, to the final collapse of a regime that had built its mythology on steel and fire. But even in the East, even in the cold of Hungary and the rubble of Budapest, the stories lingered. German tankers spoke of the Western Front, of the Americans, of the tubes. They had seen their friends burned alive in machines that once ruled battlefields. And they had learned the hardest lesson of modern war. That doctrine dies faster than men. And arrogance dies even faster. Dempsey walked through Munich when it was finally over. He didn't carry the tube anymore. He didn't need to, but he still walked like he was bracing for recoil. He still glanced down alleyways, still measured distance in meters 30, 25, 15, always thinking of angles, of armor, of whether a rocket would punch through. He'd been 19 when he first fired it. He was 21 now. And he felt 80. He passed a burned-out Panther on the roadside, its gun still pointed west. The metal had cooled. The steel was silent. But he swore he could still hear it. That low hiss. The whoosh. The moment before the myth cracked open. Years later, in training manuals, American commanders would call the bazooka a force equalizer, an innovation, a symbol of modern infantry adaptability. But for the men who had used it, it was simpler. It was a lifeline, a promise, a hand reaching out of the mud and grabbing history by the throat. They say the Panther was one of the best tanks of the war. Fast, powerful, advanced. But none of that mattered when a 20-year-old GI, in a shell crater, covered in snow, with one rocket, could end it all. In 3 seconds. That's how legends die. Not in battles. In ambushes. In silence. In smoke. In fear. In fire.